Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for today's buyer counseling session. And today you'll want to have a couple things in front of you. Your Waller Group buyer workbook. We have a 2014 and a 2015 buyer workbook with scripts and objection handlers. This is very thorough. It's based on Mike Ferry training and other coaching and training that I've had through the years, along with other consultants. Our buyer's guide template. So if you have your own buyer's guide, hopefully you have a customized buyer's guide by now. And so we have the template for you to use, and that template acts as kind of a prop through the buyer's counseling session. A couple other things that I think are good to have with you when you're with buyers: the more you show them that they can touch and feel, then the more interesting it makes your presentation. So I have a buyer card that actually shows the buyer's criteria on it. That's something we'll talk about. And then also the vendor list. So showing our VIP vendors or the vendors that have been referred by other buyers and other agents in our brokerage is very, very important to help them with through the inspection process, and also possibly for blinds and drapes and interior designers, things like that, after they're moved into their property. So let's start with the Waller Group buyer workbook. And I want to run through just some highlights on this workbook. This covers everything from prospecting for buyers through the buyer counseling session and the entire buyer sales process. So there's 4 components to the buyer sales process. The buyer counseling session is just one of those components, but the expectations that you set with that buyer are really the most important, and that's what we're going to talk about the most in the buyer counseling session. So there's some great buyer lead generation tactics and strategies that are a part of this workbook and manual. The community loan officer prospecting is another training we have. And of course, generally 70% of most realtors' business comes from their sphere of influence. So there's a lot of dialogue around the sphere of influence. Something else I wanted to touch on as far as the buyer counseling is it's very relational. Just like all of real estate, it's a relationship-based business. So knowing the personality profile of that buyer is important. So that's why when you come on board and you take the Tony Robbins assessment, that helps you. And then this is a good reference point, something to always reference. And if you're categorizing your buyers as far as their personality type, then that can help as well. So we have a lot of the common objections and the most common objections that come up during that buyer counseling session. So the scripts for a hot market, and learning those scripts on the hot market and the amount of inventory, which direction the market is going, is also important to set the proper expectation up front. Okay, so let's skip to page 31. That's the buyer consulting process. So you'll want to make sure you use that now as a reference point. So the 3 phases of the buyer consultation and the initial appointment process is: number 1, pre-qualify and condition the buyer over the phone. So that's qualifying them on their motivation and their ability. So that's going to take interaction with your lender to make sure that your lender is working and following up with your lender and with your buyer to get them approved. That may take a week, it may take months, just that part alone. So that's step number 1. Number 2, upon the mortgage approval, then confirm your buyer consultation. So that's when you'll generally set the time, whether it's a time to show them property or whether it's a time to set the consultation. And sometimes it's going to be both at the showing. But again, this is what's so important is if they are, especially this happens on sign calls, this happens on internet leads, to where they just want, if it's someone that you haven't worked with before, they just want to get in that property, right? They just want you to show them the property, and they don't really understand the value that the realtor brings. But the carrot and the key is setting their expectation for this counseling session when you do set that showing appointment. So it's fine to show them the property, make sure they understand you're going to go through a quick 20-minute counseling session with them as well. And then number 3 is completing that counseling session, whether it's at the property showing or whether it's in another site, whether it's a Starbucks or whether it's your home office or here in the office. But completing that counseling session and getting their commitment. So the buyer rep commitment is step number 3 to this, to make sure that you're successful with it. So I want to thank Anna, a new agent that has come over from Keller Williams, that's here in the audience today. And then Nana's been doing a fantastic job with buyers. She's also in the audience, and she will probably give me some good objections. Hopefully she'll throw some great objections with me. And then Claudia also does a great job working with her buyers. We have some great people here in the audience to make this interactive. So at any time you ladies have some comments or feedback, please speak up and I'll repeat it. And then we'll go through and add that to the dialogue. So I appreciate any comments or feedback and your experiences when you go through this process with your buyers. So the things that you want to set the expectation on up front are, number one, the current market conditions. You hear me say all the time, under promise, over deliver. Under promise, over deliver. This is extremely important when it comes to buyer expectations. And sometimes the buyers have to hear it 2 or 3 times as far as how the market is, where the market's moving. You know, it's your job to inform them not where it is today. They can read the paper and find out where it is today, but where is it going? So that's where knowing how to interpret statistics and interpret data and knowing your geographic market, where the market's moving. If you don't know that, then figure it out. You know, study the market, talk with Richard, talk to myself, so that way you know you have confidence and you know where your market is moving. We have a trend in DFW now over the last 2 years, 2013, 2014, to where it's about, as I was at a meeting this morning, it's the trajectory is very, very strong and moving in an upward direction. You know, 8 to 12% appreciation last year. The year before that, 8 to 12% appreciation. So having that now 2-year trend is extremely important. Then we see rent prices increase. We saw rent prices increase 2013 by 4%. 2014, the last year, rent increases have been 5% for the last year. So when you compound home property prices increasing at 8 to 12%, some areas 15% or 20%, some price ranges, the lower price ranges especially, 20, 25% appreciation. So when you know those things and you can forecast that over the next year, and historical data is what's going to help you most with your forecasting. So you have to see where the market's been before you know where the market's going. So talking with confidence and speaking intelligently about that in your geographic area, in your geofarm or your area of expertise, and that could even be a price range expertise. So you know, you hear me say a lot that if you're not number 1 or number 2 in your sector, then figure out something else to do. And this is something that we want you guys to know. When you're working with your buyers, we want you to be the expert in that specific market or in that price range or in some area of expertise to where you know that you're the best. And you can do that if you follow these practices. So number 1, current market conditions, where are they going? Number 2, the offer and negotiation process. Probably the biggest nugget that I could give in this, and that I can't emphasize enough, is if you have a buyer that they're thinking, okay, well, this is the price I'm going to offer, they usually think that's the price they're going to close at, right? And that's kind of common logic, the way it's been for years in real estate market. If I make this offer, that's what I'm paying for the property. Well, not always. The way I like to explain it, in the market that we're in right now, it's almost like an auction process. So you have to get your bid accepted before you can even think about closing on a property, right? So an analogy that you could use is, you know, we've got to get to the table. You know, let's get a seat at the table first, and that's getting our offer accepted. And then once we get our seat at the table, then we can actually have a substantial conversation and dialogue based on some of the details of why this property should close for the price we think it should close for. And your inspection is going to be your ammunition. So on a new construction home, this may be tough. On a house that's 30, 40 years old, it needs a lot of work and you don't really know what's behind the walls, this will be a lot easier. So, you know, the type of home makes a difference in this. The other factor, of course, we have to be able to sell it to the appraiser. So your buyer may offer $50,000 over list price, but if they're getting financing and it won't appraise, then that's an issue. And that's something else that at the table can be discussed. But you can't get to the table if you have 5 other offers that are standing in line behind you, and that listing agent, if they're doing their job for their seller, they're trying to get the highest offer possible and bid it up as much as possible. And it can become a real bidding war, and it's emotionally stressful for that buyer as well. So don't you think logically that your buyer has a better shot at having a negotiation if it's just you and the listing agent and the buyer and the seller at the table versus you guys and 10 other agents and 10 other buyers at the table? Does that make sense? So that's where, when you're negotiating, you have much more leverage, and you come from a much you have an upper hand the fewer people that are involved in that negotiation or that are competing for that property. So they may have backup offers. They may have people that say that they'll submit a backup offer. But a lot of agents will not execute actual backup contracts. Unfortunately, I think a smart listing agent will execute a backup contract, but a lot of them are not. So you have an upper hand to negotiate during that option period once you have it under contract versus before, when you are trying to get your offer accepted. Okay, I probably beat that dead horse into the ground so you guys understand that. Okay, so and then number 3, we'll review the Waller Group Preferred Client Agreement and TREC Buyer Representation Agreement. So those are the 3 components to a buyer counseling session. Now, that may sound really simple, just following those 3 components, but a good presentation and a good counseling session is based on that buyer's current expectation of the market. So you have to flush out what, did their brother buy a house for 180,000 and they think they can find a house for 180,000, and then you find out, well, that was 10 years ago. We've all had that happen too. So you have to find out where are they coming from, what's their frame of mind, before you can have a proper counseling session with that. So these brokerages or these trainings that say, you follow this specific script or you follow this specific format, you cannot do that. You'll put that buyer to sleep if you do that. These presentations must be based, and this goes with any presentation, any sales presentation. It's based on that consumer, that client's preconceived perceptions of the marketplace and what their expectations are of the market. And you have to put them in reality. And giving analogies to put them in reality helps them a lot. And nothing helps better than telling stories. So that's where trainings like this and being in this kind of venue, when we can hear Claudia's stories and Nina's stories and my stories, then use those stories for your buyers as well when they're giving you, well, my brother bought a house and he got it for 180,000, and that's, why can't I do the same? So, okay, so the home searches, as far as their expectations and what they're looking for, that's one of the things that needs, expectations of where the market is and making an offer is one. Expectations of what they're looking for in a home is another. We see a lot of buyers that want homes no older than 10 years old, or they want to be in a certain school district. That's fine, but are those realistic? Make sure that you have realistic boundaries established up front in that session, in that search. The other mistake that I see a lot of agents make is that they're not maintaining constant communication with the buyers once they set up that search. So buyers will almost always change their expectations as they look at 3 or 4 homes. That's why showing them 3 or 4 homes initially up front is not a bad idea, because that expectation may completely change after you've been out with them and they see, the photos are not exactly like they are on the internet. So that's something else. If you're calling them every week, if it's an A buyer, that's someone that's ready, willing, and able to buy right now, if they're an A buyer, then you need to be in touch with them every week, if not more, to find out if their criteria is changing. And that's a real simple conversation. Just, have you seen anything else outside of your criteria that you may be interested in, or is there anything else that that you'd like to change as far as opening up more properties for us to choose from? Because if they're not being notified of new properties each week, then there's not enough in their price range, and they're probably not realistic with their expectations. So there needs to be weekly, probably 3 properties, 5 properties or more a week that are coming on the market that are within their expectation. If not, the conversation needs to be had about adjusting that, maybe changing the boundaries, maybe looking at other school districts, and going back to the counseling session as far as what they're looking for. Okay, so as you go through that and identify the commitment and their expectations. So understanding that they have a clear understanding of the market and how to make an offer on a property, because you want to do this. It's important to do this before they find a property. Once they find a property, sometimes they're emotionally invested, and it looks like the greedy agents just after their commission, right? You know, that you're telling them these things just because you want to get this property sold. Well, that's why it's so important to do this up front in the counseling session, so that way you come across as a consultant, as a professional, not as someone that's just trying to get this property under contract and close a commission. So it's a very fundamental understanding that you guys need to have. And the other thing is, properties are moving so fast right now, you don't want them to have to go through the stress of learning all this as they find a property that they want to make an offer on. So especially with first-time home buyers, it's most applicable. So let's go ahead and fast forward to the most common buyer objections. First, I want you guys to give us buyer objections that you get in the counseling session. So what are some buyer objections that you get? Number one would probably be, well, why do I need to sign a buyer rep agreement? You know, tell me kind of how those conversations have gone with you guys in the past when it comes to buyer rep agreements or the preferred buyer agreement. You know, the Waller Group preferred buyer agreement is in your buyer's guide, and that is a template for you guys to use. And some people are intimidated by that 4-page or 6-page buyer rep agreement, the TREC agreement. And but there's also no reason that should not be signed. But nonetheless, that's another reason we have the preferred buyer agreement, because it really does clearly explain all the things that we bring as a brokerage and what the value proposition is. The value proposition is so critical in also once you have their expectations aligned, then what is it that you're doing for them that's different than your competition? Showing them the I Have a Buyer card, showing them the marketing you're doing to find properties, the closed Facebook groups that we have access to, that you guys have access to, Real Estate Friends for Dallas, the North of LBJ Real Estate Friends for the North area. Different areas have closed Facebook realtor groups. Knowing the for sale by owner inventory, the old expired inventory. There's so much more than what's in the MLS. Really educating them that what's in the MLS is sometimes the leftovers. So you're out there identifying the best properties available. So how you find properties is extremely important to them being loyal to you and to earning the credibility that you need to have them make a commitment, because you want people that are committed to you. But explaining that properly is important, and a lot of that is addressed in your buyer's guide. So tell me a few objections that you guys get after that counseling session, you know, why they wouldn't commit to the preferred buyer agreement, or maybe why they're reluctant to commit to a buyer rep agreement.
It's usually when they don't understand the purpose of it, and it's usually with clients that don't know me. If it's a referral or someone I know, then
right,
it's kind of easier, but I think it just goes with explaining it and then knowing the value of it and the benefits of them.
Right. So Venus made a great point. She said usually the people that are reluctant are people that maybe are online leads, or they're people that, let's say an open house, someone that doesn't really know her, or they're not referred. So they would be sign calls, and usually that's going to be sign calls, online leads, and open house buyers. So those are the ones that she said explaining your value proposition is the most important, because they don't really know what a realtor does. Otherwise, they'd probably be with a realtor committed, right? So that's critical. What did I forget something on that? Yeah, so she said those are the ones that are reluctant. So the way it's explained is really important. Another one would probably be, well, I don't want to be committed to you for 6 months. We usually suggest a 6-month commitment for the buyer rep agreement. So, you know, the way I handle that objection is, well, what if it's just for properties that I identify for you? And I'll write this in, only properties that I identify, and write that in special provisions. Usually, if they're a fair person, it's not a problem. They're comfortable with that. Let's say it's an investor. They work with 10 different realtors, and they say, you know, whoever brings me the property is the person I'm getting. But I never signed buyer rep agreements. Well, let's think about this. If I bring you a property, then first of all, I want to make sure I'm compensated for my time, because of all these things that I do to find properties for you that other realtors don't. And if you're working with any realtor out there, then how obligated are they going to be to you versus someone else? So Investors are probably the ones that you really want to make sure you put in special provisions that it's only applicable to properties that you identify for them. And they may want to have realtors in different areas. I've seen that a lot with investors where they'll have areas in different realtors in different counties or different cities. So that can also be specified on that buyer rep agreement. You can write anything in special provisions. If it's just for one property that you're showing them and you normally don't work with buyers, you can just write it in for that one property. You know, there's no reason to not have a buyer rep agreement when you're working with a buyer or after you finish that counseling session. Any other objections? Nina, you had some good ones last week. What are some other common, let's just go on to common buyer objections that you get through the process.
Just through the process?
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to offer list price because I'm going to be at the top of the market, and what the market crashes.
All right. What if the market crashes and I don't want to be at the top? Okay, so that's a great objection, and that's where when you look at historical trends, and you being the professional, we know that cycles usually happen in 10-year cycles. And I think most economic, there's in the early 80s was a cycle, in the 90s was a cycle, and then the worst cycle we saw. Usually the deeper the bottom it is, then the longer the recovery and the longer it lasts better. So we had the last cycle was so bad, it was they compared it almost as bad as the Great Depression. So we expect a longer recovery time in this next cycle. So it ended in 2012, so we're only 2.5 years into recovery. So we have another good, strong 5 to 9 years into the recovery. And that's being very, very conservative. So that's something that, and then you're going to be in the peak for a good 18 months to 2 years. So real estate's not like the stock market where you have these dramatic ups and downs. Normally the valleys are about a year to 18 months, and the peaks are usually a year to 18 months. And in such the dramatic decline we had in the last one in 2008 through 2011, it was so deep and so long that we'll probably have a longer recovery. It'll last for longer. And here we've seen 8 to 12% increases for the last 2 years. So really, statistically, when you just look at history, we have another 7 to 10 years of great recovery. And even if it's not 8 to 12% price increases a year, let's be very conservative with just a 6% price increase a year, then this is a fantastic time to buy. The other thing to think about are interest rates, because we're also at historical lows for interest rates, and interest rates will continue to move up. So that's something that there's no other investment that they can have and leverage that much money, that much cash into an investment. So they basically are getting the bank to make their investment into their savings account. What kind of other investment works like that? Only in mortgages, and it's subsidized by the government. You've got Fannie and Freddie backing these loans, and FHA. So you're, as a first-time buyer or as an owner-occupant buyer, because those are the only ones that are backed by FHA and Fannie and Freddie, typically are mostly owner-occupied loans. So there's a huge advantage that you get that someone on Wall Street or some other investor doesn't get. So leverage that, use that to your advantage. And I always compare it like a lotto ticket. If you qualify for a loan in this market, then it's just scratching off your lotto ticket to see how much you qualify for, and let's go turn it in and find a house. So great objection. What are some others that we hear from buyers?
I'm going to wait till the summer. I don't see that much inventory, so I'm going to wait till the summer.
Want to wait till the summer? I don't see a lot of inventory right now. Great. I understand that. And typically what happens in the spring market, what we see are the greatest price increases. Do you know why that is? And that's part of the sales process. You always want to ask them why, to keep them engaged. Well, that's because people that wait to the spring to list, they want top dollar. So they've prepared their homes for the spring market. You hear that term a lot, the spring market. And that's because they've maybe painted, carpeted. These are the premium properties that are going on the market. So naturally, they want more money than someone that's listed in December, or someone that's listed their home when it's snowing for 3 weeks. Or why would someone list their home when it's a month of snow in January? They must have to sell, right? And it's probably not. there could be a bank owned or a distressed sale. So those are usually the lowest sales amounts, and they're usually the most beat up inventory. Sometimes it's leftover inventory that hasn't sold from last year. So the spring market is what, it's when it blooms fresh flowers and fresh listings. So these are fresh premium properties. So naturally they're going to sell for more, 3 to 5% more. Now, here's what happens, Mr. Buyer. If you're looking in this market and we find something in the spring market, number one, we're looking at better inventory than what we would be looking at over the last 6 to 9 months. Number two is that the prices that you can find today are going to be better than the prices that you find in the summer and in the fall. You know why? Because appraisers have to use comparables, properties that have sold in the last 6 months. So right now they're comparing it with these low sales in the last 6 months, right? And over the winter, and to where once these spring listings, these fresh new listings sell at 3 to 5% higher, then appraisers see this, that these are selling higher, and it's establishing a trend. So then what's the next seller going to do? They're going to ask more, right? If they were able to get 3% more, then I'm going to ask 5% more. Well, that's how the market works, and that's why prices always peak in the summer and in the late summer, because you've got your spring inventory that comes on the market that fuels your appraisal comparables and sales for summer sales, and summer sales typically are at a higher amount. So yeah, I buy properties myself. Almost every property I've ever bought myself has been in November, December, or January, because you usually get the best deal, and I'm a bottom feeder when it comes to value. But and investors a lot of times buy during those months. But the best inventory available to choose from they're going to be properties that are not properties you're buying as rental properties, but properties that you want to live in, that's the premium inventory in the spring and summer months. 65% of all sales and transactions happen during the summer months. So that's something to think about. People that are moving and you're scheduling movers, always remind them of that. These moving companies and vendors get extremely busy. Contractors get very busy. So make sure that you're giving plenty of time with your contractors in that process. In our buyer's guide, we also have a new improved moving checklist. It's an extremely valuable checklist with links to the Postal Service to change their postal, links to the DPS to update their driver's license, links to our preferred moving companies, contractors. It's a fantastic moving checklist. So remind them of all the benefits that are in that, and prepare them for those things that they need to know about based on seasonality. And seasonality is what we're talking about when we're talking about the pricing throughout the year. What are some other objections we get with buyers? Maybe
wait until my house goes under contract before.
Great. I want to wait for my house to go under contract before I start looking at something else. The extremely common objection in this market with a real lack of inventory. So to me, the quick answer is, well, let's look at new construction, because new construction really makes a lot of sense. New construction makes more sense in this market than it ever has before, as long as I've been in real estate since 1997. Because if you can get a brand new home built with the specs that you want, I would be selling a lot of new construction right now if I was a realtor in the marketplace. And you can control that moving time frame to an extent as well. So new construction would probably be one thing that I would really push. And new construction, a lot of that, especially here in the in-town, uptown market, is not in the MLS, because they're selling at frame stage, or they're selling. Last two I sold before they were ready, and they weren't under the MLS. So that goes for a lot of the new construction sales here in the area. So that's where knowing your geofarm, knowing the builders, what's coming up is really important. So the possession, explain the possession time frame, how they can lease the property back. And it's common, especially in this market, to lease your own property back for 60 to 90 days. So they may want to wait to list because of that. But you can have a delayed closing and also a lease back. So sometimes you can have a 6-month buffer there based from the time you list to the time you actually have to move. So that's something else to remind them of. Another common objection that I used to get a lot is, well, we've only looked at a few houses, and we want to look at more before we make a decision. No matter how great of a deal it is, no matter how good of a house it is, that's just what we've decided. Well, or my cousin looked at 30 houses before they bought, or we looked for, my sister looked for a year before they. So So there again, peeling that onion to find out what their objections are up front before you write an offer. And that's why during that counseling session, a key question you want to ask before you start showing the property is, if we find the right home today, is this something that you are prepared to make an offer on? So many times as agents, we assume that, but it's very similar to the question you ask before you go out to list a property. If you're comfortable with everything that I have to say and you're comfortable with the price, will you move forward with the listing agreement when I come out Tuesday at 4 o'clock? That's so important. It's the most important question you can ask. And I would say the same thing with a buyer counseling session. One of the most important questions you can ask is, if we find a house today, or if I show you that, these sign calls all the time, if I show you this house and this is something that you like and it meets your needs, are you prepared to make an offer on it this afternoon or when I show you the home? Set that expectation up front. If you don't set that expectation before you show that property, you are doing yourself a huge disservice, because your time is all you have as a professional. Your time is valuable and your time is money. And so those two questions before you got on a listing appointment and on a buyer appointment are extremely critical. It will flush out so many different things. Well, my dad needs to look at it before we make an offer. Well, my wife and I don't do anything unless she's with me. Or, well, we want to look at 30 houses before we make a decision, no matter how great this house is. But you can never predict what they're going to respond. But if you don't ask that question, then shame on you, because it's your fault for not flushing that out before you get there. So let's go through some of those scenarios. If they come back and say, well, I want to look at that more homes, then that's where telling a story makes such a difference. And I can think of countless stories to counter this objections, to where buyers have passed on a home because of whatever reason, and they could never find another house that compared to it. Sometimes they've paid 3%, 5% more than the house that they missed. Mr. or Ms. Buyer, I don't want that to happen to you. So to keep in mind, my job as your realtor, one of my primary jobs is to mitigate your risk, to reduce your risk as much as possible. So would you agree that if we can write an offer on this tonight, and if we have I can get you an option period to where if you just wake up on day 9 and decide you want out of it for any reason, no matter what it is, if you just don't like the color like you did, then you can terminate, and it costs you, worst case scenario, $250, $500, whatever that option fee is that you negotiate. So frame it that way. Frame it that you're helping them, you're informing them to make better decisions by mitigating their risk and showing them what the least amount of risk that they have attached to that offer. And then the next thing, of course, would be the question, okay, the offer price. So if we do make an offer on this, then are you prepared to pay X amount? Oh, no, we don't pay that. So these are all conversations that are really, really important to have before you get to that property, or before you identify a property. Because once you identify that property, then it's the greedy realtor that's trying to get a commission closed. So to really take that to heart. What are some other objections or things that come up to where they don't want to write an offer on it? Giving them stories. Sometimes buyers have to hear this 2 or 3 times, different stories of different people, that the houses that they lost, or maybe their offer wasn't high enough and there were 8 offers on the home, or there were 2 offers on it. And if we just would have, paid, given them the story about the analogy of getting to the table, and unless we get to the table, we can't have a conversation. And right now, this agent, they're trying to bid it up as much as possible. So we have to compete just to get to the table. And your $200 or $500, whatever it is, its option fee, is not at risk. It's only at risk if they accept our offer. let's first try to don't worry about the $200 or $500 until they actually accept it. And so let's take one step at a time. And sometimes buyers get stressed out with that, and that's where the buyer counseling session, actually taking them through the flow chart, especially with first-time buyers, and showing them the flow of that transaction. And I think, something we may want to think about is a flow chart of actually the negotiations, because like a negotiation flow chart, because that is something that buyers are, there's a lot of stress around that. What other objections can you guys think of that buyers give?
I don't want to pay over market.
I don't want to pay over market. Okay, great objection. And let's first look at where the market is. Let's look at where the market has been, and then it's my job to give you an indication or a recommendation of where I think the market is going. And that's pretty easy to do in this market. I mean, when we've got appreciation of about 1% a month, then basically by the time they have a delayed closing of 3 months, or occupancy for whatever reason, it may be they may already have 3% equity by the time they close on that property, or by the time they move into that property. By the end of the summer, they may have 6% equity in it based on how the market's moving up right now. So that's where new construction is such a beautiful thing right now, is that if you can lock in a new home and it won't be ready for 6 months, and you can lock it in at today's price, gosh, you may have 6% equity when you close on the house. So but that works both ways. There's a lot of builders that are reluctant to lock in a price for that long because materials, lumber, concrete, labor is moving up so fast. And as that moves up in this market and land prices, it makes all the other existing homes worth a lot more money. So another thing to counsel your buyers on is buyers like to think about price per square foot. Number one, you cannot look at price per square foot. You have to do a CMA on a house, and you keep in mind there's an adjustment factor. What we normally recommend is half the price that's average for the neighborhood as your adjustment factor. So if the home is 3,200 square feet and the average neighborhood home is 3,500 square feet, then that price per square foot obviously is going to be higher on that smaller home. And we always hear it's good to get the smaller home in the better neighborhood, right? Well, that's because you've got more upside potential there usually. But so don't let them, you have to educate them on how appraisers look at price per square foot. When this appraiser, they don't just look at what the other homes have sold for per square foot. They put weight on each sale, and they use an adjustment factor of about half the average price per square foot for the neighborhood. So you take the difference, that's where your CMA class and knowing your CMA is important. I won't go into that, but make sure that most buyers and a lot of even sellers don't understand that adjustment factor instead of the full value for price per square foot. I got a little bit off track there, but what are some other things that I think the inspection negotiation, there's so many different negotiations that happen throughout the sales process, and your offer is just a first one. The other one is the inspection. So we have the inspection that's also an opportunity for us to negotiate. The other one is the appraisal. That's another possible opportunity for us to negotiate on the price. So until those two things happen, then we may be really jumping the gun as far as our offer price. Right now, let's just get to the table and let's get our offer accepted. And then those are two other negotiations that could possibly happen. But keep in mind, under promise, over deliver. You don't want them to have the expectation that they're going to go in and be able to renegotiate. But there again, you want to use your words very carefully. Based on your prior experience, based on your past experience, this is what you've seen happen with other buyers and with other sellers. And based on your experience, we'll have a better chance of being able to negotiate at that point than now if we're competing with 4 or 5 other offers. So be very careful with your wording there and the expectation that you set with that buyer. Okay, we'll wrap up otherwise. Any other objections that come up? Let's think of any objections that come up through not just the buyer counseling process, but through the entire sales process.
I had a buyer, we were going back and forth on counter offers with the seller, and it was a condo that was built in the 70s in Oaklawn, and he saw all the new construction of all the apartments, and he didn't want to move forward because he said he didn't want the oldest condominium or property in the area.
Great. Okay, so age was a real objection for this buyer, is what Venus was saying, and it was in a condo-driven market. So condo-driven markets are usually much higher land prices. So your price per square foot for the land is extremely high. Right now in Oaklawn, it's running about $80 to $90 a square foot in North Oaklawn for land. So the older product usually is a 1 or 2 story product versus a newer product that's going to be 3-story or maybe even multiple, but a lot more vertical. So keep in mind, at a condo, even though you only own the inside portion of that unit, you still own a percentage of the total common area in that development. So there's value in that land if it's an older condo complex generally. So it's something that should be taken into consideration there. And generally an older condo complex, his price per square foot is going to be less than new construction. You cannot get anything that's going to be new construction condo in that area if it's in the same immediate area for probably less than about $200 a square foot. So I'd be curious what the price he's looking at for his older condo. If it's higher than $200 a square foot, it's probably because it's 2-story versus 3-story. When you have a 2-story product, it's much more marketable than a 3-story product. You'll notice townhomes, 3-story townhomes, the turn on those is real high. People generally don't live in those longer than about 4 or 5 years. Other objections that you see come up?
During the inspection, whenever the buyer hears like the water heater's old or something, they're like, I want them to replace the water heater, I want them to replace the HVAC just because it's old, but it still works. Great.
So Nena had a great observation about the inspection period and the inspector scaring them with the age of the appliances and things. So always, there again, prepare the expectations. If it's an older property, anything older than 10 years old, usually that inspector is going to depreciate the life of the mechanicals and the hot water heater and appliances, because that's, according, quote unquote, to inspectors, the lifespan of a hot water heater or appliances or mechanicals. Oh, I've seen mechanicals last for 30 years that are fine. So I've seen hot water heaters that are 20, 30 years that are fine. So don't let that, just because it's beyond what they consider the average lifespan, doesn't mean that it's not working or it won't last. And then also, of course, remind them about the home warranty and the added protection that they have on a home warranty, which most sellers will pay for. But there again, setting that expectation up front is important. The other thing on any older property that's probably older than 10 years old is explaining how building codes change and how inspectors inspect today's building codes. But older properties, that's just not the way they built them back then. So you can't, your expectation has to be a little different on an older home or product. And one of the ways that I phrase it is why it's good to go to the inspection at the end when they're wrapping up, to have that discussion and to talk with the inspector and the buyer. And some key questions that you want to ask that inspector is, well, if you were buying this property, what would you think? They may say, oh, well, it's great. This is one of the cleanest cleanest condos I've seen in 4 years. It's like, it may be a totally different perspective. So make sure the way you frame that and the way you ask that inspector, well, what, if you were in this situation, what would you do? The other thing that I would ask is, based on other properties that you've seen or inspected, how does this compare with other properties this age? So you've got to put it into context for these buyers, that the inspector, their job is to find defects, that they want to earn their money. So that's what they're trying to do, is find defects. That's what good inspectors do. But let's put it into context as far as the age of the property, and also if it were them and if it was their kid that was buying this, what would they do? What would they think? So, and then also same goes for the cost to repair. So, okay, so we've got it isolated now to these certain items that we would suggest repairing or would want repaired, whether we do it ourselves or whether the seller does it. Now, let's figure out what that's going to cost, and let's have that conversation now. And, Mr. Inspector, based on what's your feedback on that? Why not get free advice from the inspector? It's out of his field, but he's there. Let's go ahead and start being proactive and asking about the cost of these things to cure. And then that's when you're on the way back to the office, sometimes before you even have a copy of that report, on the phone with your contractors or on the phone with the listing agent, preparing them, listing agent, worst case scenario, also getting your contractors out there so that way you're not backed against a timeline to get bids or to get these things done. Many times your contractor may have a different price than what the seller's contractor does. So that's where our preferred vendors and preferred contractors provide a lot of value in that transaction. Other questions that come up during the inspection, the appraisal process, having comps for that appraiser, having a conversation with that appraiser is usually good. The more communication there, usually the better. But that's a whole nother, and that can be a whole nother training. Okay, so I'll wrap up there. If there's any other questions, thank you for attending, and thank you for for using these things that we've put together for you guys, and do use them. They're great benefits. And the buyer's guide has just been updated in the last, I think, 2 weeks. So make sure you're using that most recent template. Have a productive week. Thank you.